Hello, welcome back to the latest We Are Sunderland briefing with myself, Dom Shaw and Scott Wilson. And just a heads up that this might be our final video of 2024, hence the fact that we're going to have a look back at what has been a bonkers roller coaster year. We'll get into that. But just a heads up at the start, really, to say thanks for all the support this year. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for listening if you're listening on your podcast platforms. And do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already on YouTube. Rate, review, podcast, wherever you get your podcast, as we say every week. And we're going to have a look back at what has been an eventful year on Wearside. Thanks, as ever, to our partners, Cospex Opticians and the Fans Museum. Scott, I was just looking before we started. On Boxing Day last year, Sunderland beat Hull to move into the playoff places. Now, if you'd looked at the table then and looked at the table now and had no idea whatsoever what had gone on in between, you could never begin to imagine just how up and down and how much of a roller coaster ride 2024 has been for Sunderland. Because despite the fact Sunderland were well positioned in the league, there wasn't a good feel around the place at the start of the year. There is at the end. We'll get to how that's happened. It's been quite the 12 months.
Yeah, I funny enough, I just did exactly the same thing, because you have to kind of remind yourself just where Sunderland were this time last year. And I just had a look. Obviously, they beat Preston on New Year's Day, and again that lifted them back up to 6th. And because of how quickly things unraveled and how bad things got in the second half of last season, you kind of forget that actually this time last year, as you rightly say, in terms of league position, Sunderland were bang there. Now, obviously, the Michael Beale thing was just starting to unravel. The FA Cup game was looming on the horizon, and we all know kind of everything that went on around that. Clearly, that had major repercussions off the pitch in terms of just the general mood around the club. You know, I think that fed into an awful lot of what happened in the second half of last season. I really do. Clearly, the Michael Beale thing just got out of hand really, really quickly. Then there was the Mike Dodds. You know, now, listen, I think an awful lot of what we felt in the second half of last season, I think now you've got to look at it anew in some ways. And I'm not saying give the club a free pass, because I do think they got things wrong in the second half of last season. And I think a season that, you know, I'm not saying Sunderland would have made the playoffs, but I think a season that shouldn't have gone as badly wrong as it did went disastrously wrong. But if Christian Speakman was sat in front of us now and said, well, we had to go through that to get to a point where we would bring in Le Bris, we'd make the changes we made in the summer, we always knew we'd get to where we are now. Well, you've probably got to give them a bit of a pass for that now, haven't you? Now, you know, Le Bris wasn't the first choice, was he? Will Still was where they were going. So, you know, in some ways, it's difficult for them to make that argument and it be wholly believable. But where they've got to now, you know, maybe there was an element of having to go through everything that went on in the first half of the year to get to where we are now.
And to put it frankly, what you've suggested there is Sunderland knew what they were doing all along. Now, early in the summer, early in the summer, when we were sat having these conversations, we were saying the exact opposite.
Yeah.
So what did happen? I mean, you sat with Speakman, didn't you? You were on a call. I can't remember and you spoke to him after the appointment. After the appointment was confirmed, he talked about the kind of path to how it led to Le Bris. What did happen in the final months of the season and the early stages of the summer? Because it was a strange old time.
I think the idea that it was part of some, you know, grand plan that fell into position perfectly, I don't think so, you know, anyone, even Speakman and Louis Dreyfus, can hand on heart try and push that narrative, because clearly things happened in the intervening period. Now, what I would say in fairness to them is they made a decision fairly early on that bringing in a manager in February, March time was not the right thing to do. And that even though things were unraveling under Mike Dodds, and even though the season ended horrendously, and there was a lot of ill feeling, quite rightly, amongst the fans over that, They made the decision, we're still better holding fire and going for an appointment in the summer when people are available, when we can have the discussions we want to have, rather than knee-jerk and bring someone in who we would have to give a contract to for 2, 3, 4 years, and actually they might not be the right man. Now, I think in hindsight, that's probably been shown to be the right decision. It didn't feel like it at the time. And I still think the way last season ended in lots of ways is unforgivable. But to be fair to Sunderland, they've ended up with a head coach who is clearly, I say clearly, who feels like is a lot superior to who they might have ended up with if they'd hit the panic button in February, March and gone with the type of manager who was being touted around then. Now, as I've said, the idea then that this is all some great plan and it was always going to be Le Bris, and, Christian Speakman will say Le Bris was always one of our candidates. He was always in the equation. He was always in the conversation. I think that's true. He wasn't the number one, was he? We all know that if Will Still, in that couple of days when it looked like he was coming in, had said, right, that's it, let's sign this, I'm going to Sunderland, Will Still would have been the manager at the start of the season. In the end, it feels like it's turned out to be a real stroke of luck for Sunderland that hasn't happened, because then they turn to Le Bris. Le Bris comes in, and we'll get to that in further on in this vid. But clearly, he's been a superb appointment. So I guess in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is that in hindsight, I think where we were kicking Sunderland left, right, and centre for what they were doing in the second half of last season, that's probably a bit harsh now. But then on the flip side, I also don't think they can say that this is all a grand plan that's perfectly fallen into place, because there's been, little bits of U-turns and changes along the way.
Beale feels like an eternity ago.
Doesn't it? Doesn't it just?
You've covered Sunderland for years. You've dealt with countless managers. How now, with time, do you reflect on that Beale tenure and dealing with him and all that surrounded it?
It was shambolic, wasn't it? It was a mess. What I would say is, it feels like Le Bris, for the first time, is the type of head coach that Sunderland have always wanted. That Speakman and Louis Dreyfus have always wanted to fit their model and to be leading, their playing side of their operation, if you like. Alex Neil clearly wasn't really that fit. Tony Mowbray, for all that he was great, wasn't really that fit. Hence the recruitment issues, hence the problems, all of that kind of stuff. Le Bris is that fit. Now, Beale probably was that fit. He's a coach more than a manager. It may well have been that had things turned out differently, he would be ticking a number of the boxes that Le Bris is ticking in terms of being that head coach figure and not being a manager in the old school sense. The problem with Beale clearly was just politically, he had absolutely no idea about how to be Sunderland boss. He got himself into so many blind alleys. He was like a rabbit in the headlights dealing with that side of it. And tactically and in terms of what he was doing on the pitch, it wasn't working well either, was it? Let's be honest. So, in those side of things, it was just a disaster. And it was quite evident quite quickly, wasn't it? It was going to be a disaster. We both sat in press conferences with him and post matches with him and stuff and thought, goodness me, what, where are you going here? What's going on here? And the performances weren't right. But like I say, I can kind of understand why Sunderland went for that type of figure. He was just the wrong person in that mould.
And Le Bris, on the flip side, what he's done in isolation has been impressive enough. But when you consider all that had gone before, and I think something struck me at the weekend after being at the Stadium of Light for the Norwich win, in the second half of last season, Sunderland looked scared playing at the Stadium of Light, didn't it? The weight of the expectation, it didn't look like a happy place for Sunderland players to play. They didn't win a single game at home after February the 10th, I think it was. This season so far, 11 home games, 7 wins, 4 draws. I think the 4th best home record in the division. That startling turnaround in itself just shows, I think, how impressively Regis Le Bris managed to draw a line under all that had gone last season and start afresh.
Yeah, and I think, again, in hindsight, I think it probably helped that he was coming in completely from the outside.
Blind,
yeah, almost blind to it. That when Le Bris was kind of, when it became obvious that he was going to be the head coach, I think there was an element of, goodness me, where has Sunderland plucked this guy from? He's been relegated in League One last season. What's he going to know about Sunderland? What's he going to know about the mess that he's walking into? What's he going to know about the way things have unraveled at the end of last season? Well, he clearly knew. He'll have watched all the videos and stuff. But what he wasn't was, in any way, shape, or form, drawn up in any of that. He could come in with a completely new set of eyes, say, I couldn't really care less about everything that's happened in the past. I'm the head coach. I think there's quality in this squad. I'm going to give you all a chance. I'm going to have a look at you in pre-season. We'll hit the ground running. We'll get going, and we'll go from there. He's clearly a supremely skilled tactician. We've seen that. He's got an awful lot of really, really good qualities as a coach. His in-game management, his ability to set sides up, his man management looks like it's excellent, the way that he's handling the young players. But I think probably, like you say, that the most impressive thing he's done is just, eradicated almost the memory of just how horrendous things were before he walked through the door. And from the minute he's come in, it's felt like a new dawn. It's felt like a clean slate. And, he does deserve an awful lot of credit for that. But like I say, I think it kind of helped him that he could shrug it off and say, well, that's got nothing to do, that's got nothing to do with me. None of that is baggage that I have to carry around me. And it hasn't been, has it?
And Speakman and Louis Dreyfus, regardless of where you stand on like how much they'd planned ahead and how much did they land on the feet, was this all part of the grand plan, whatever. I think their bravery still needs applauding, because on the back of such a shambolic end to last season, all the questions that were being fired their way, two things really. Had Speakman got this appointment wrong, I don't know whether his head had been on the block, but he'd have certainly been the one taking the questions, wouldn't he? With that in mind, to have the courage really to appoint someone who's just been relegated, it's a big move. It's a bold move. If it goes wrong, where do you defend?
Yeah.
How do you defend that? They clearly had real confidence in him and looked beyond what had just gone on in the French.
And I mean, you got that from the brief of the chat we had with Christian Speakman after he came in. I mean, he basically said, look, our view on it is the fact that he's got relegated. That's the only reason we can get him. If he hadn't been relegated, he'd be still in Ligue 1. He'd be going to bigger clubs in France, or there'd be clubs all over Europe interested in him, because, Speakman was quite interesting. He was basically saying, all the clubs have access to the same data tools. They're all looking at the same metrics. The boxes that Le Bris is ticking for us, he's ticking for a whole host of other clubs around the continent. We know there's interest in him. I just think we were able to get him because he'd been relegated, and some clubs would look at that and think, maybe we need to see him somewhere else to see if he actually is the real deal. Well, as you say, fair play to Speakman and Sunderland. They took that risk, and it was a risk. There's no doubt about that. It was a gamble, but they took that and they backed themselves, and it's worked. Now, we'll get to recruitment, I'm sure, in a minute, and I think there's still major questions to be asked there, and it's going to be really interesting to see where Sunderland go in January and all that kind of stuff. But purely in terms of their decision to go for Le Bris, I mean, it already looks a masterstroke, doesn't it?
On recruitment then, because that was where I was going next. What are those questions that you think need answering?
Well, how would you mark Sunderland's recruitment over the last 12 months? It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because clearly there's been some massive successes. I mean, Joe Bellingham looks superb. Mundell looks like, fairly unheralded, but certainly in what we saw of him early in the summer, looked a pretty decent replacement for Jack Clark, who I think understandably Sunderland opted to sell. I think what's interesting is, if you look at the successes in Sunderland's recruitment over the last 12 months, they've largely, if not pretty much exclusively been domestic, haven't they? They've been players who have come in a lot from academies at other clubs, a lot from, Premier League club, the likes of Ballard and clearly Job. And I know that, that wasn't a Premier League club, but players who have come in from, domestically. It's been the overseas signings, Awashish, Bar, Ekwe, that haven't worked. And yet, all we're hearing is that's still probably the route that Sunderland are predominantly looking to go down. Now, there have been tweaks to that. We saw Metham obviously come in as a type of signing maybe Sunderland wouldn't have made in the past. To be fair, Isidore is an overseas signing who, certainly to a certain degree has worked. But it's those, as I say, those Awashish, Bar, the likes of Bennett, who was heralded when he came in, they're the signings that haven't really worked. And it's going to be interesting to see in January, in the summer, to what extent Sunderland are still going to be ploughing down that overseas market, bringing in your likes of Rusin, players like that, or whether there is a sense that, we've started to tilt a little bit towards more domestic and an odd older signing and a bit more of a balance in terms of recruitment. Maybe we'll carry on that and go a bit further down that route. I think that's going to be interesting to see.
You mentioned Clark there. I often think that successful transfer models all hinge on selling players and being able to sell players. And what you would say with Sunderland and Clark, and I know we're only half a season on, but the key clearly is knowing the right time to sell and having a replacement, preferably in the building already, because then selling clubs, no, you haven't got 10 million quid or whatever, burning a hole in your pocket. You need to replace your best player. Well, I think Sunderland have ticked both boxes. In the Mundell in the second half of last season we only saw flashes of him, looked nothing like a player who you could say, well, he'll replace Clark. But I think giving him the second half of last season, even in the difficulties of last season, just letting him get his feet under the table and bedding him in. And I'm sure, no doubt, although no one would say it, I'm sure in behind the scenes conversations saying, look, like, if and when Jack moves on, this is your spot. But also Watson, also knowing that you've got Tommy Watson there and maybe gauging the time of this summer of, right, the time might be right for Watson this year, turning down the bids from Brighton. I mean, what a snip Brighton had got if they'd have been successful with a couple of million quid, whatever they'd bid for Watson. But the whole Clark deal now, at the start of the summer, that had the feel of being the greatest fear really for Sunderland, losing Jack Clark. It's looking more and more like a really successful deal.
Yeah, and I think the time was right for everyone, wasn't it? Sunderland had, to be fair to them, they dug their heels in previous windows over Clark. I think had Sunderland not had stopped Jack Clark from leaving this summer, I think there would have been questions over Clark's level of motivation and, would the toys have come out of their pram to a certain extent, And obviously, contractually, he clearly wasn't going to sign a new deal. So his value was only going to start depreciating. I absolutely think it was the right time to sell. And like you say, they had put plans in place for that. Now, I'm not saying January, but clearly over the course of the next, 12, maybe 18 months, Rig, Bellingham, potentially Dan Neil, potentially Anthony Patterson,
Ballard.
Potentially Dan Ballard.
You could go on and on and on.
Go on and on. You're going to have decisions to make over all of them. January certainly still feels like a month where Sunderland will dig their heels in and say now is not the right time. If they don't go up, that'll be a harder conversation to have in the summer. And it'll be an increasingly harder conversation with every transfer window that passes if those players continue playing at the same level and if Premier League clubs are coming in for them. Now, at the minute, the succession kind of planning that we talked about with Clark doesn't really feel like that's happened yet in terms of those players. I think that's fair because I don't think they're going to be losing them in January. So there's not the need to do that yet, really. But I think there will be over the course of the next year. If we're having this conversation in another year's time and reviewing everything that's happened in 2025, I think what happens with Rig, Bellingham in particular, but all of those young players in terms of who, if any, leave, What does Sunderland do with the money, and who's in place to replace them? You know, that feels like what's going to dictate, you know, what will be the burning point we talk about if we're doing this for 2025. Clearly, the wild card in all of that is promotion. If Sunderland win promotion in May and get back to the Premier League, then it's a completely different conversation about a whole host of things. If they don't, then I think the futures of those players become what we talk about.
I hope we're doing this at the end of 2025, by the way, because it means if you're watching now, you've probably still been watching for another year or so. Giving us
yeah.
Giving us a reason to keep chuntering on. What to wrap
it means
up?
We're still in a job.
yeah. What then? In short, to wrap up, what's a successful 2025? Promotion feels too black and white, does it, or doesn't it?
I don't know. At the start of the season, then to say that this, you know, Sunderland, I don't want to say if Sunderland don't win promotion, it'll be a failure, because it won't be a failure, will they? They're overachieving in terms of where we thought they would be. And if Sunderland miss out on promotion, you know, there is every chance that you can still make the argument that this has been a hugely successful season, way better than what we thought in the summer, way better than what you had the right to expect for Le Bris's first season in English football, way better than what you had the right to expect from this young team and this young players. The problem with that is we all know how good Sunderland have been in the first half of this season. We all know where they're sitting. We all know the gap that currently separates them from being out of the playoffs. You know, I'm not saying that that's a done deal. It certainly isn't. But Sunderland have put themselves in a fantastic position where the very minimum I think they should be looking at is a playoff place. And they're still banging the argument for a top two. I mean, you know, for most of the vids we've been doing, we've kind of been couching it in, yeah, but Leeds look strong. They're probably going to kick on. Sheffield United are good. Burnley are good. Well, yeah, they all are. But Sunderland are right up there with them. And so I don't want to say a failure. It will be a massive disappointment if Sunderland do not make the playoffs. And it will be a disappointment if they don't get promotion this season. It won't be a failure. They're two very different things. But I think the position they've got themselves in now, you know, there's Sunderland have every right to regard promotion and still automatic promotion as a really realistic possibility for the first half of 2025. Clearly, that's got to be the aim and the target.
Let's wrap up there. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, depending whether you watch on YouTube or listen on your podcast platforms. Just
before we finish, couple of quick fire ones. Player of the year. Who's your player of the year?
Of 2024, I think I'd go Bellingham.
I'd go Rig, I think. Just for
I'd go
strides he's made and where he's coming. I mean, Bellingham's a very, you know, both of them are valid choices, I think.
I think Hume's been consistently brilliant.
Yeah.
Ballard as well.
The fact you've got so many options to talk about.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I think I'd go Bellingham because I thought he managed to maintain a level throughout the difficulties last year, and he's established himself as a clearly a pivotal player again this season, hasn't he? It might help that I'm saying this on the back of watching him score a winner against Norwich, which came on the back of a winner against Swansea. But yeah, I think I'd go Bellingham. Go on, what was your other one?
Disappointment of the year then. The flip side. I mean, yeah, we've kind of touched on them, I guess, earlier in the vid, but go on.
Disappointment of the year. Last January.
Well, there's so many you can pick from
like last January and all.
I think I still go back to the Derby. Everything around it. It was just such a mess.
Yeah.
Like the lead up to it was, you know, clearly shambolic, and then on the pitch they just didn't even try and lay a glove on Newcastle. That was the disappointment. You
could say January in general, couldn't you? January in general, like the kind of rot was starting to set in. Although they were still getting results in the league at the time, but you could tell they weren't going anywhere. It did not have anything resembling the feel of a promotion winning season. Then obviously the disappointment of the window, and then the Derby.
Moment of the year.
Moment of the year.
That's a difficult one, really. There's been some real highs, but kind of moment of the year.
Maybe Melier.
Oh yeah,
Leeds,
that's a really good shout.
the last minute, because that
Yeah,
was
that's a really, really good shout.
because that
I mean,
is one of them where in 10 years' time you're still saying,
yeah,
"I
remember that that
beats
day.
ball."
Yeah,
Obviously,
that's a great shout. Actually, I don't really think you can look past that, can you? Yeah.
it's as though we prepared. It's as though we prepared for that quick fire.
Yeah, anybody looking at me kind of desperately looking down here where I've got my stats book and that, will say, yeah, the preparation, Mellier was a good shout. I'll go with that.
If you watch us but don't read our stuff, you can subscribe to We Are Sunderland. It's just £1 for 6 months or £12 for the full year. So take advantage of that offer. Or if you're desperately scampering around for a Christmas present for a Sunderland fan,
I
then
tell you,
there you go. £12 for a year. That's all it'll cost you. So
Santa would be all over that, wouldn't he? All over that.
It is red and white. Have a lovely Christmas, a fantastic New Year. If we don't, we might do a video next week, but it's so hard to know kind of where, what it's like at Christmas time. So with games and presses and all that, it's just going to be a case of seeing where we are really and where we stand. So we might speak to you before New Year, but if not, have a brilliant New Year, lovely Christmas, and we'll speak again next time we record We Are Sunderland. Take care.